On a warm spring afternoon in rural Alabama, the little town of Fairhope gathered in numbers it hadn't seen in years. The church bells rang bright and steady, echoing across rolling fields and quiet roads, and every pew inside Morning Light Baptist was filled to the brim. Folks stood along the aisles, craning their necks, whispering to one another, eager to witness what many believed was nothing short of a miracle. Sheriff Thomas Reed, 50 years old, the man who had spent 3 decades keeping their town safe, was finally getting married again. For most people there, Thomas wasn't just the law. He was the anchor of the community. He had been the one who responded when their barns caught fire, when their children went missing for a few anxious hours, when trouble came knocking in the dead of night. He was steady, unshakable, and God-fearing. Widowed for more than 20 years after his first wife died in a tragic car accident, Thomas had lived quietly, never entertaining gossip about dating, never seeming to need companionship beyond his Bible and his duty. Folks often said he carried his cross alone. So when news spread that he had met someone, a young woman named Sarah, and that she had agreed to marry him, it felt like the heavens had opened. Sarah was a sight that afternoon. 25, graceful in a way that seemed both innocent and magnetic, she walked down the aisle in a gown of soft white satin, lace glimmering under the light pouring through stained glass windows. Her smile carried both nervousness and sweetness, and though few in town had really gotten to know her yet, the whispers had been kind. She had moved here only months before, working at a small boutique on Main Street. People said she was polite, soft-spoken, always greeting customers with gentle eyes. And now, against all odds, she was marrying the most respected man in Fairhope. The ceremony unfolded with the weight of tradition. Hymns rose from the choir loft. The pastor spoke of loyalty, faith, and the blessing of second chances. Townsfolk dabbed at their eyes, charmed by the picture before them. The aging sheriff, his broad shoulders softened by joy, standing hand in hand with a radiant young bride. Some called it a fairy tale. Others, whispering behind their programs, wondered what Sarah had seen in a man more than twice her age. But most brushed those doubts aside. Who were they to question God's timing? When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, Thomas looked into Sarah's eyes with something that almost resembled disbelief. It was as if he couldn't quite grasp how such beauty, such youth, could belong to him. He kissed her hand, and when the pastor declared them husband and wife, the sanctuary erupted in applause. Children clapped, elders murmured blessings, and the church doors swung open to sunlight, spilling warmth over the couple as they walked out to the waiting crowd. The reception was held in the fellowship hall, where tables were lined with casseroles, sweet tea, and pies brought by nearly every family in town. Music played from a scratchy speaker, and Sarah twirled in her dress as Thomas laughed, a sound most people hadn't heard from him in years. He looked lighter, almost younger, as though he had finally laid down the burdens of solitude. Neighbors toasted him, raising glasses of lemonade, congratulating him for finding happiness at last. For a moment, it felt as if every broken piece of his past had been put back together. But beneath the cheer, there were small cracks no one cared to notice. Sarah's eyes, though bright, carried a flicker of distance, as if she were watching the evening unfold from far away. She laughed when expected, thanked every well-wisher, yet there was a strain behind her smile, a weight that suggested secrets not meant for this crowd. When she danced with Thomas for the first time, her hands rested gently on his chest, but her gaze slipped toward the shadows of the hall, as if searching for something, or perhaps dreading what might come. Thomas, too, had his moments of silence. While others saw only a man reborn, he felt something more complicated. Joy, yes, but also unease he couldn't quite name. As he watched Sarah laugh with the children, accept hugs from the women of the congregation, he felt a strange pull deep inside him, a whisper he quickly shoved aside. It wasn't doubt about her beauty, nor about her kindness. It was something harder to define, something lodged in memory that refused to surface. He told himself it was only nerves, the natural awkwardness of a man who hadn't shared his life in so long. When the night wound down and the last of the guests left, the town's chatter followed them out into the dark. People would speak of this day for weeks, maybe years, the day Sheriff Reed, the steadfast widower, found his second chance at love. They'd remember the way Sarah glowed in her white gown, the way Thomas smiled like a man redeemed. For the people of Fairhope, it was a story to believe in, a sign that God's blessings came in his own time. But behind the closed doors of the sheriff's home, far from the eyes of the town, the fairy tale would take a darker turn. The story was only beginning, and soon the happiness everyone celebrated would curdle into something no one could have imagined. The honeymoon's sweet sat in silence after the reception ended, the echo of laughter and music fading into the spring night. Sheriff Thomas Reed stood awkwardly by the window, his black suit jacket draped over a chair, his calloused hands fumbling at his tie. The sheriff had faced down armed fugitives, negotiated tense standoffs, and walked into burning houses without hesitation. Yet standing there with his new bride in the soft glow of lamplight, he felt more uncertain than he had in decades. Sarah moved about the room with the ease of youth, humming softly as she unpinned her hair and let it fall in dark waves across her shoulders. Her cheeks were still flushed from the evening, from all the attention and endless congratulations. She caught Thomas staring and offered him a smile, sweet, nervous, and inviting. For a moment, the strangeness melted, and he felt like a man again, not just a sheriff weighed down by years of duty. He walked to her slowly, resting his hand on hers, and whispered that she looked beautiful. She blushed, then leaned forward, pressing her lips against his with a tentative boldness. For Sarah, this was the moment she had both dreamed of and dreaded, because marriage meant intimacy, and intimacy meant revealing every part of herself. She wanted to believe Thomas's love would withstand it, that his heart could stretch far enough to embrace all of who she was. The kiss deepened, the tension in the room thickened, and Thomas's hands, clumsy but tender, moved across her shoulders and down her waist. He felt the softness of her skin beneath the satin fabric, the curve of her back, the gentle tremor of her breath. Yet when his hand slid lower, brushing the side of her hip, he froze. There, beneath the smoothness, his fingers traced a line, raised, jagged, unmistakable. A scar. Not just any scar, but one he had touched once before long ago. 20 years ago, when his son Jacob, barely 10 years old, had vanished after a horrific accident near the river. Jacob had fallen, cut himself badly along his right side, and for weeks the boy bore the mark as it healed. It was the kind of wound a father never forgot, the kind that etched itself into memory as deeply as into flesh. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, the air in the room suddenly thin. Sarah tilted her head, noticing the way his expression changed. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice fragile. Thomas pulled his hand back as though burned. He forced a laugh, muttering something about being tired, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He excused himself to the bathroom, shutting the door behind him, gripping the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white. He stared at his reflection, his face flushed, his temples damp with sweat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Yet the scar had been there, in the exact same place, the exact same length and curve. His mind flooded with memories. Jacob's laughter, his sudden disappearance, the endless nights spent searching, the years of grief that followed. And now, here on the body of the woman he had just vowed to cherish, he saw the past clawing its way back. Sarah, on the other side of the door, sat at the edge of the bed. She hugged her arms around herself, sensing the shift. She had known this moment might come. Secrets like hers did not stay buried forever. But she had hoped for more time, days, weeks, maybe even months before questions surfaced. On their wedding night, though, so soon, her stomach tightened with dread. When Thomas emerged from the bathroom, he avoided her eyes. He climbed into bed beside her, but kept his distance, lying rigidly on his back, staring at the ceiling. Sarah turned toward him, brushing her hand across his chest, whispering, "Are you all right?" "Just tired," he muttered, but sleep never came. He lay awake, listening to her breathing, studying the faint outline of her body beneath the sheets. Each rise and fall of her chest only deepened the unease gnawing at him. He remembered the scar again, the way Jacob had cried that night by the river, the blood soaking his shirt, the way Thomas had carried him home. He remembered the promises he had made as a father, promises broken the day Jacob disappeared. By morning, Thomas looked like a man haunted. Sarah woke to find him already dressed, his face pale, his jaw tight. He kissed her forehead quickly, too quickly, then claimed he needed to run errands. She nodded, forcing a smile, but the pit in her stomach grew heavier. That afternoon, when she left the house to fetch groceries, Thomas slipped into their bedroom. With the precision of a man trained in observation, he plucked a strand of hair from her brush and placed it carefully into an envelope. He locked it in his desk drawer, his hands trembling as he resolved to send it off for DNA testing. The rest of the week passed under a cloud of strained politeness. Sarah sensed his growing distance, the way he avoided long conversations, the way his gaze lingered on her side when she undressed. At night, he mumbled prayers under his breath, clutching his worn leather Bible, his lips moving in the dim glow of the lamp. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, to tell him the truth herself, but the fear of rejection silenced her. In town, neighbors commented on how radiant the new couple looked. A perfect match, one woman said at the diner. Thomas smiled stiffly, but his thoughts churned beneath the surface. He could not confess what gnawed at him, not yet. First, he needed proof. First, he needed to know whether the nightmare in his mind was real. When the letter finally came, an unmarked envelope with lab results tucked neatly inside, Thomas sat alone at his desk. His eyes scanned the words once, then again, his breath catching as the truth crystallized. 99.9% probability of paternity. Sarah was his child, his Jacob, his lost son. The paper slipped from his hands. For a long moment, he simply stared at the floor, every muscle in his body stiff with horror. The woman he had married, the bride the town had celebrated, was no stranger at all. She was his blood, and in that revelation, something inside Thomas began to unravel. Thomas didn't go home right away after reading the DNA results. He drove aimlessly through the back roads of Fairhope, past fields he'd patrolled 1,000 times, past the river where he had once searched for Jacob until his boots filled with mud and his lungs burned with grief. He parked beneath an old oak tree and sat for hours, the crickets screaming into the night, the paper trembling in his hands. The results were clear, scientific, undeniable. Sarah wasn't just his bride. She was his child, his Jacob, the son he had mourned, transformed into someone he could not comprehend. When he finally walked through the front door, Sarah was in the kitchen, humming while she set the table for supper. She looked up, smiling, her face glowing with the soft light of domesticity, the way a new wife might. "You're home late," she said gently. Thomas stared at her, the warmth in her eyes striking him like a blade. How could she look at him like that, knowing the truth? He said nothing during dinner, just pushed food around his plate. Sarah tried to make small talk, about the neighbors who had stopped by the boutique, about a dress she was sewing, but the silence between them grew thick, suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, cold. "We need to talk." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. She had known this moment was coming. She followed him into the living room, her heart pounding, her hands twisting in her lap as she sat opposite him. "I had a test done," Thomas began, his words like stone. "Your hair, DNA." Her face drained of color. Tears welled in her eyes before he even finished. He didn't need to say more. She understood. He knew. "It's true, isn't it?" His voice cracked, a mix of rage and disbelief. "You're Jacob. You're my son." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ceiling fan. Then Sarah nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Yes," she whispered. "I was Jacob once, but I'm Sarah now. I've always been Sarah inside." Thomas shot up from his chair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Don't you dare say that. You were my boy, my blood, and now you." He broke off, choking on his own fury. "You tricked me. You shamed me in front of God, in front of this whole town." Sarah stood too, reaching out a hand toward him, pleading. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never came here to shame you. I came here because I needed you. I needed my father. Do you know what it was like to grow up alone? To feel abandoned? I searched for you for years. Her voice cracked as she told him about the foster homes, the cruel taunts, the way she had always felt like a stranger in her own skin. She spoke of the surgeries, the hormones, the endless fight to claim her own identity. I found peace as Sarah, she said softly. And when I found you again, I wanted more than anything for you to see me. Not as a mistake, not as a curse, but as your child who loves you. I wanted you to be proud. But Thomas's face twisted, red with rage and shame. Proud, he spat. How could I be proud of this? Of you turning against the body God gave you? You stand here in a wedding dress, pretending to be something you're not, and you expect me to call you my daughter? You expect me to live with this sin under my roof. Sarah's tears streamed freely now, but she didn't back away. I didn't marry you to deceive you. I married you because I thought maybe it was the only way you'd let me close. You were always so hard, so unreachable. I thought if you loved me as a wife, maybe one day you could love me as your child again. Her words cut deep, but Thomas hardened himself against them. His whole body trembled as he grabbed his Bible from the table and held it tight, as though it were a shield. This is an abomination, he hissed. This is the devil's work. God is punishing me through you. Sarah stepped closer, her voice breaking. No, Daddy. Please. I'm not a punishment. I'm your child. I'm right here. After all these years, I just wanted my father back. For a moment, Thomas faltered. The word Daddy stirred something old and aching inside him, a memory of a boy with scraped knees running into his arms. His eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. But the shame was louder, the weight of faith heavier than blood. He shoved the feeling down, replacing it with fury. Don't you call me that, he barked, turning away. You're not my son. You're not my daughter. You're nothing but a sin I have to carry. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, her body shaking with the release of years of pain. You can hate me all you want, she whispered through her tears. But I am yours. I'll always be yours. Even if you bury me in the ground, I'll still be your child. The words hung in the room like smoke. Thomas stood rigid, his Bible clutched in his hands, staring at her with eyes that no longer saw his bride, or his child, or even a human being. Only a test he believed God had set before him. A test he was terrified he was about to fail. Thomas Reed sat in his office long after midnight, the glow of a single desk lamp casting deep shadows across the wood-paneled walls. The Bible lay open in front of him, its pages worn from decades of use, its margins smudged with notes and underlines. His hands trembled as he traced the words, though the lines blurred together. He read the same verse over and over again, Leviticus, Corinthians, Romans, passages he'd clung to his whole life as proof of order, proof of God's will. Yet now, those same words felt like chains tightening around his chest. He could still hear Sarah's voice from earlier, the desperate way she had cried Daddy before breaking down in tears. It was a sound that had cracked something in him. For the briefest instant, he had wanted to reach for her, to hold her like he used to hold Jacob when nightmares woke the boy in the middle of the night. But just as quickly, shame swallowed that impulse. Shame and fear. What would people think if they knew? That the town sheriff had married his own child? That the lawman who preached faith and morality had broken both God's law and man's law under his own roof? He pressed his fists into his temples and groaned. It felt as if two voices battled inside him. One whispering of forgiveness, of grace, of love that could heal. The other roaring of damnation, of wrath, of hellfire waiting if he did not cleanse this stain. The louder voice won, again and again. Over the following days, Thomas withdrew from everyone. At church, he sat stiff in the pew, avoiding eye contact. Parishioners congratulated him on the marriage, but he gave little more than a nod. At the station, deputies noticed how distracted he seemed, staring out the window instead of listening to reports. He began carrying his Bible everywhere, muttering prayers under his breath, his lips moving even in silence. At night, Sarah tried to bridge the distance. She cooked his favorite meals, touched his hand gently at the dinner table, whispered words of longing. Sometimes she dared to ask him about Jacob, about the boy he once lost, testing the waters to see if he could connect the dots in a different way. Each time, Thomas shut her down with cold stares or slammed doors. Yet his silence was not indifference, it was torment. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered out to the church grounds. The moon hung low, bathing the small white building in silver. He fell to his knees by the cross outside, clutching his chest, and begged God to tell him what to do. "Why bring this back to me?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why send my own flesh dressed as sin to my door?" The wind rustled the trees, and in the rustle Thomas thought he heard words. Not words of comfort, but commands. Cleanse, purify, sacrifice. His breathing quickened. Was it madness? Was it faith? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that his heart pounded as though God himself were speaking. By morning, the sheriff's house felt colder. Sheriff sensed the change. His silence had hardened into something sharper, something dangerous. He barely looked at her. At breakfast, he prayed aloud for long minutes, his voice rising and falling like a preacher's, while Sarah sat frozen with her coffee growing cold. He ended the prayer with a chilling line. "Lord, give me the strength to cast out what is unholy in my home." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, please," she said softly. "I'm not unholy. I am your child. Don't let hate blind you. You can still love me. You can still save us." But Thomas looked at her as if she were a stranger. His face twisted, red and strained, his jaw tight enough to crack. "Don't speak of salvation. You're not here to be saved. You're here to test me. And I will not fail, my Lord." The days blurred together, filled with prayers, fasts, and endless reading of Scripture. He stopped shaving. His deputies muttered that the sheriff seemed haunted, but none dared confront him. At night, he dreamed of Sarah's voice calling Daddy from underground, as though she were already buried, already reaching for him from the dirt. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced it was a prophecy. Sarah, meanwhile, grew more desperate. She tried once more to reason with him, telling him of the foster homes, the surgeries, the way she had nearly ended her life before finding the strength to become Sarah. "You weren't there then, but you can be here now," she pleaded. "You can still be my father." For a moment, Thomas's heart wavered. He wanted to cradle her, to say yes, to admit that he had failed her once and didn't want to fail again. But then he saw the wedding band on her finger, the symbol of a union they had already tainted. The shame roared back, suffocating him. He shoved her away, muttering scripture, retreating into prayer once more. The townsfolk saw the cracks, but couldn't guess the truth. They thought Thomas was simply overwhelmed by new marriage, by the burden of leadership. At Sunday service, he stood taller than usual, his voice booming as he read from the pulpit, warning against sin, against the devil's deceptions. Some said he preached like a man on fire, his eyes wild, his hands shaking as he gripped the Bible. Inside, though, he was collapsing. His faith had become a noose around his neck, and every glance at Sarah tightened it further. He could not live with her truth, and he could not live without a solution. In his mind, only one path remained: sacrifice. A terrible, final act that would prove to God, to himself, and to the world that he had not faltered. By the end of that week, the decision hardened in his chest like stone. He would cleanse his home. He would cleanse his town. He would cleanse his soul, even if it meant burying the only child he had left. It was a Thursday night when Thomas finally acted on the storm that had been brewing inside him. The air was heavy with humidity, and thunderheads rolled in the distance, their low growl echoing across Fairhope's empty streets. Sarah was in the living room, curled up with a blanket, flipping through one of the old hymnals Thomas kept on the shelf. She wanted to believe that if she immersed herself in the songs of the church, maybe she could bridge the impossible gap between them. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his broad frame filling the entrance, his sheriff's badge glinting faintly under the dim lamp. He carried his Bible in one hand, a lantern in the other. His voice, when he spoke, was strangely calm. "Sarah," he said, "come with me. We're going to the church. Tonight we pray." Sarah hesitated. For days she had felt his coldness curdle into something darker. Every glance he gave her was sharp enough to cut, every prayer louder, fiercer, like a man possessed. Fear stirred in her belly, but another part of her still hoped that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find peace. "All right," she whispered and stood. They walked together through the silent town. The streets were empty, shutters drawn against the storm. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple stabbing into the night sky. Inside, the pews sat in shadow, and the smell of old wood and candle wax hung in the air. Thomas led her not to the sanctuary, but around the back, to the patch of earth by the foundation stones where the grass grew thin. The lantern's glow flickered across his face, and Sarah saw a look she had never seen before. Not rage, not sorrow, but something colder. His eyes were fixed, as though he had already rehearsed every step of what was about to happen. "On your knees," he commanded softly. Sarah's throat tightened. "Thomas, please, what is this?" "We're going to pray," he said, his voice low but steady. "You need to ask the Lord to forgive you, to cleanse you, and I need to show him that I will not let sin live in my house." Tears welled in her eyes as she sank slowly to the ground. She clasped her hands, whispering words she wasn't sure she believed anymore. "Father, forgive me. Forgive the years I was lost. Forgive the lies. Forgive me for wanting to be loved." But Thomas wasn't listening. He stood over her, murmuring his own prayers, his Bible open, the words spilling out in a fevered chant. His voice grew louder with each verse, until it cracked with fury. "And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." Sarah flinched. "Stop it," she cried, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her hands reached for him, trembling, desperate. "Please, I am still your child. Look at me. You don't have to do this." For a heartbeat, his face faltered. The word "Daddy" rang in his ears, bringing back the memory of Jacob's small hand clutching his. But then his jaw set, and his eyes hardened once more. "You are not my child," he hissed. "You are my test." With a sudden motion, Thomas swung the heavy lantern into her temple. The crack of glass rang out, followed by a gasp as Sarah slumped to the ground, stunned, her body crumpling into the dirt. She tried to lift herself, her hands slick with blood, her voice no more than a broken whisper. "Please." Thomas stood over her, chest heaving, his mind drowning in scripture and thunder. He whispered fiercely, as though speaking not to her, but to God, "I will not fail you." The storm broke then, rain beginning to fall in sheets, soaking the ground, plastering Sarah's veil to her face. She struggled weakly, crawling a few inches before collapsing again. Thomas knelt, pressing his palm to her forehead in a grotesque parody of a blessing. "Be cleansed," he murmured. "Be freed." The rain hissed against the earth as Thomas began digging with his bare hands, clawing at the mud, his fingers tearing on roots and stone. His breaths came ragged, but he dug furiously, a man possessed, until the hole gaped wide enough. He dragged Sarah's limp body toward it, whispering all the while, prayers, fragments of sermons, desperate cries that blurred into madness. Lightning split the sky as he lowered her into the pit. Her eyes fluttered open one last time, glassy and terrified. She tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged. Thomas leaned close, his lips against her ear, and said, "This is the only way back to him." As he shoveled the first mound of wet soil over her, Sarah's weak hands pushed upward, her fingers clawing at the mud. A muffled sob tore from her throat. But Thomas kept going, each shovelful faster, heavier, drowning out her muffled pleas. He cried as he worked, tears mixing with the rain, his voice hoarse as he chanted, "Lord, receive her. Lord, cleanse me." The last sound he heard before silence was the faintest, most heart-wrenching call, "Daddy." It slipped into the night like smoke swallowed by the storm. And then there was nothing, just the pounding rain, the trembling sheriff, and the fresh mound of earth pressed tight against the side of God's house. The rain was relentless, hammering down in sheets that turned the red Alabama clay into heavy, clinging mud. Sheriff Thomas Reed stood, trembling over the open grave he had clawed into the earth with his own hands, his Bible slick with water, its pages curling and bleeding ink. The lantern lay shattered nearby, its flame long extinguished. Only lightning lit the scene now, each flash throwing his weathered face into sharp relief. Eyes wild, jaw clenched, lips moving in frantic prayer. Sarah lay at the bottom of the shallow pit, her wedding gown soaked and plastered to her body, her chest rising in desperate, ragged breaths. Mud smeared her face, streaked with blood from the lantern's blow. She blinked slowly, dazed but still alive, her lips trembling as she whispered through the rain, "Please." For a heartbeat, his resolve wavered. That single word cut deeper than any blade, reminding him of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and a little boy who once clung to him as though he were the whole world. But just as quickly, he forced the memory down, suffocating it under scripture and shame. In his mind, Jacob was gone. What lay before him now was an impostor, an abomination in God's eyes. "You are not my son," Thomas growled, his voice breaking. "You are not my daughter. You are my burden, and I will not let the devil claim me through you." He scooped the first heavy clump of earth into his hands and dropped it onto her legs. The mud landed with a wet thud, splattering her gown. Sarah gasped, her body jerking as she realized what he intended. Panic flooded her face. She tried to sit up, reaching weakly toward him, but the pit was too deep and her body too battered. "Please," she cried, her voice ragged and thin over the roar of the storm. "I don't want to die. I came back for you. I came back because I needed you." Thomas's tears mixed with the rain as he shoveled more mud over her. Each handful felt like both punishment and release, each scoop accompanied by the muttered rhythm of prayer. "Forgive me, Lord. Cleanse me. Lord, forgive me." Sarah writhed, her hands clawing at the walls of the pit, her fingernails tearing bloody furrows into the clay. "I'm your child," she screamed. "You can hate me, you can call me anything, but I'm still yours. Doesn't that mean anything?" For a split second, he froze, staring down at her face streaked with mud and tears, those eyes wide with the same pleading look Jacob once had when thunderstorms rattled the windows. But then thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground, and Thomas took it as a sign. With a guttural cry, he bent and threw another mound of mud over her chest, pinning her arms. Sarah's screams turned to muffled sobs as the earth pressed down heavier, rising to her shoulders. Her voice broke into prayers of her own, frantic and terrified. "God, save me. God, hear me." Lightning illuminated her face, her mouth open in a silent cry as Thomas dumped more earth into the hole, burying her inch by inch. Her hands twitched above the surface, fingers clawing desperately for freedom, until he covered them too. He could feel the faint push against the dirt as she struggled beneath, could hear the muffled cries fading into silence. His body shook violently, racked by sobs and shouts as he continued, mud clinging to his arms, his uniform soaked through. When the last of her veil disappeared under the earth, he collapsed to his knees beside the mound, pounding his fists into the wet clay as though sealing a coffin. His chest heaved, his throat raw, his prayers now hoarse whispers. "Take her, Lord. Take her from me. Do not let this sin walk among us any longer." But even as he prayed, the sound wouldn't leave him. Beneath the storm, beneath the rolling thunder and rain, he swore he could still hear her, the faintest scratching, the muffled echo of her last cry, haunting him like a ghost he could never bury. He pressed his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth, but the phantom voice echoed in his skull. The storm raged harder, the church bell groaning against the wind as if tolling for a funeral no one had attended. Hours later, when the rain finally softened into drizzle, Thomas stood over the grave, exhausted, covered in mud and blood. He had buried his secret in holy ground, convinced he had done what was necessary to prove his loyalty to God. Yet his soul felt no lighter. If anything, The burden pressed heavier, as though the very earth knew what he had done and would never let him forget. He stumbled back toward the parsonage, leaving muddy footprints on the church steps. Behind him, the grave looked disturbingly uneven, a patch of disturbed soil beside the house of God. He didn't notice the hem of her wedding gown peeking faintly through the dirt, swaying with the wind like a ghostly hand waving for help. The next morning, townsfolk arriving early for prayer meeting would see it, their gasps shattering the silence. But for now, in the dead hours before dawn, only Thomas Reed knew what lay beneath that mound. And though he had silenced Sarah's cries, her last word echoed endlessly in his ears, refusing to be buried. Daddy. The storm passed, leaving Fairhope washed in silence. By Sunday morning, the white church on the hill stood beneath a pale sky, its steeple gleaming as though nothing had happened. Parishioners arrived early, dressed in their best, baskets of food in hand for the fellowship meal. They chatted about the sheriff's wedding, about how happy Thomas looked, about how blessed he must feel to have found love again. No one knew that, just a few yards away, the bride lay beneath a mound of damp earth. It was Mrs. Odessa Moore, the church's longtime organist, who noticed it first. She was carrying a basket of biscuits around the side entrance when her foot caught on something sticking out of the ground. She looked down, frowning, and gasped. A shred of fabric, white and heavy with mud, protruded from the soil. At first she thought it was a rag, maybe discarded after the storm. But when she bent closer, her heart stuttered. It wasn't a rag. It was satin, lay still visible through the dirt, wedding lace. Her scream pierced the morning stillness. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. Men with shovels rushed to dig, their hands trembling as clumps of soil gave way. And then, horror. The unmistakable shape of a body emerged. A pale hand pressed against the earth as if trying to claw free. When they uncovered the face, gasps turned to cries. Sarah, Sheriff Reed's new bride, was there in her gown, her lips blue, her eyes closed, streaks of mud framing her features. The congregation recoiled in shock. Children clung to their mothers. Men pulled off their hats. Women covered their mouths. No one could make sense of it. How had she come to be buried here, in holy ground, still dressed in her wedding gown? Word spread like wildfire. By noon, the churchyard was crawling with deputies, state investigators, and reporters from Montgomery who'd rushed down as soon as they caught wind of the story. Cameras flashed as men in uniforms carried Sarah's body away on a stretcher, her veil trailing like a ghostly shroud. Thomas stood among them, his uniform spattered with mud he could not quite wash away. He tried to keep his face composed, but the whispers rose around him like a storm. How did she get there? Why at the church? Why is he shaking? Detective Lionel Price, a young investigator with sharp eyes, noticed the sheriff's trembling hands and the scratches along his forearms. Sheriff, he said firmly, we're going to need to ask you some questions. At first, Thomas resisted, claiming ignorance, suggesting Sarah had wandered off during the storm and somehow fallen victim to foul play. But Lionel was not easily swayed. He studied the grave, the shovel marks in the soil, the lantern shards nearby. It didn't take an expert to see this had been no accident. When the coroner's report came back, the truth cut deeper than any rumor. Sarah had been buried alive. Soil was found in her lungs, her fingernails cracked and filled with dirt from desperate clawing. She hadn't simply died, she had fought for breath, for life, until the earth claimed her. The revelation shattered the town. The idea that their beloved sheriff, the man who had sworn to protect them, could be tied to such horror was too much to bear. Some refused to believe it, insisting outsiders must have framed him. Others pointed to his strange sermons in recent weeks, his growing obsession with sin, the way his eyes had turned wild. Within days, Thomas was arrested. The sight of him being led away in handcuffs, head bowed beneath the courthouse steps, was burned into every mind. The same people who had applauded him at his wedding now jeered, shouted, spat. Cameras captured it all, broadcasting Fairhope's shame to the nation. On the news, anchors spoke in solemn tones. In a shocking development, Alabama Sheriff Thomas Reed has been charged with the murder of his bride, Sarah Reed, whose body was discovered buried beside the very church where they wed just days before. Authorities confirmed DNA tests show Sarah was not only his wife, but also his biological child, believed to have been lost 20 years ago. The case has already ignited fierce debate nationwide. Across America, viewers argued, was Thomas a madman, broken by grief and twisted by faith? Or was he a zealot, deliberately snuffing out what he saw as sin? Church leaders issued statements condemning the crime, while some fringe voices defended him, calling his act a misguided attempt at righteousness. Back in Fairhope, silence filled the church pews. Families who had once trusted Thomas with their children now spoke his name in hushed tones, afraid of the shame it carried. The grave behind the church was refilled, a simple wooden cross marking the spot. Some left flowers. Others crossed the street rather than walk near it. Detective Lionel, who had seen his share of crime scenes, admitted later that this case haunted him most. "I've never heard a town so quiet," he said. "It was as if the ground itself was holding its breath, like Sarah's cries were still trapped beneath it." And perhaps they were. For Thomas Reed, the sheriff who once embodied duty and faith, the image of his bride child buried beneath the church would never fade. For the people of Fairhope, it was proof that even the most trusted men could harbor darkness too deep to comprehend. The courthouse in Montgomery was packed so tightly that summer morning that people spilled into the hallways and pressed against the windows, straining for a glimpse of the trial that had captured the nation. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, their notepads ready, cameras flashing each time Sheriff Thomas Reed was led in, shackled, and dressed in an orange jumpsuit. The man who had once cut an imposing figure in his crisp uniform now looked smaller, hunched, his face gray and lined, his eyes darting as though searching for an escape that no longer existed. The charges were read in a solemn voice. First-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and aggravated assault. The room buzzed with whispers, but Thomas kept his gaze fixed forward. When asked for his plea, his voice was steady, not guilty. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of horror. Assistant District Attorney Caroline Hughes stood before the jury, her tone sharp but measured. She spoke of Sarah Reed, a young woman who had returned to her father after years apart, seeking love, recognition, and belonging. Instead, she was deceived into marriage, branded a sinner, and buried alive beside a house of worship. Hughes's voice trembled with outrage as she held up photographs of the shallow grave, of Sarah's dirt-stained hands, of her gown clotted with mud. She fought for breath. Hughes said, her eyes locked on the jury. And he, the man sworn to uphold the law, denied her even that. The defense countered with a narrative steeped in pity. Thomas's attorney, an older man named Paul Henson, described his client as a faithful servant of God who had been undone by grief and confusion. He emphasized Thomas's lifelong devotion to church and community, painting him as a man overcome not by malice, but by madness. "This is not the story of a murderer," Henson insisted, pacing before the jurors. "It is the story of a father who could not reconcile his faith with a truth too heavy to bear. He acted not out of hatred, but out of a delusion that God himself demanded this sacrifice." Witness after witness took the stand. Parishioners recalled Thomas's fiery sermons in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death, his obsession with passages about sin and purification. Deputies testified about his distracted behavior, his long absences from the station, his muttered prayers during patrol. And then came the coroner, who delivered the detail that silenced the courtroom. Sarah's lungs had been filled with soil. She had been alive when the earth closed over her. At that, even the most stoic jurors shifted uncomfortably. Several spectators wept openly. The camera panned to Thomas, who sat rigid, clutching a small Bible he had insisted on bringing with him. He did not flinch. He did not cry. Only his lips moved, whispering scripture beneath his breath. When the defense called Thomas to the stand, the room held its breath. He rose slowly, shuffling to the witness chair, and raised his hand to swear the oath. His voice, though weary, carried the authority of a man who had once commanded respect. He spoke of the night Sarah revealed the truth, of the scar that haunted him, of the DNA test that confirmed his darkest suspicion. "I lost my boy once," he said, his eyes fixed on the jury. "And then the devil brought him back wearing a dress." Gasps filled the room. Thomas continued, his tone unwavering. "God showed me what had to be done. He told me to cleanse my house, to bury the sin, and I obeyed. If that makes me guilty in your eyes, so be it. But in his eyes, I am forgiven." The words landed like stones. Some jurors turned away. Others scribbled notes furiously. Across the gallery, Sarah's friends from the boutique sobbed quietly, unable to reconcile the image of their gentle coworker with the sin Thomas described. Closing arguments sharpened the divide. The prosecution demanded justice for a young woman silenced by the very man she had trusted most. The defense pleaded for compassion, arguing that Thomas was not evil but broken, his mind poisoned by religious delusion. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, voice steady, and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence followed swiftly, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted, some cheering, others crying, the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. Thomas showed no emotion. He only bowed his head, whispering once more, "Thy will be done." The case divided the country. On talk shows and in church pulpits, debates raged. Was Thomas Reed a monster who murdered his child to preserve his pride? Or was he a tragic figure, a man consumed by his own twisted reading of faith? National headlines branded it the sheriff's bride case, and for months, it dominated conversations about religion, family, and identity. Back in Fairhope, the church doors remained locked. The grave where Sarah had been found was marked with a simple stone bearing only her chosen name, Sarah Reed, beloved and remembered. Some locals left flowers there every Sunday. Others spat as they passed, unable to forgive what they saw as deception. In prison, Thomas remained unrepentant. He led Bible study sessions among inmates, preaching about sacrifice and redemption. To some, he was a prophet. To others, he was a madman clinging to delusion. But he never once asked forgiveness from Sarah, nor spoke her name without bitterness. For those who had loved her, the pain never dulled. They remembered her laughter in the boutique, her gentle way of listening, her determination to live as her true self despite every obstacle. In the end, that determination cost her life, but also left a mark on everyone who heard her story. And so the town of Fairhope carried on, scarred but not silent. Parents held their children closer. Pastors tempered their sermons. And each time the church bell rang, people remembered the young bride in the white dress, buried beneath the soil by the man who should have loved her most. Because some sins are not born of flesh. Some sins are born of fear. And when fear is baptized in blind faith, it can turn a father into a killer and a wedding into a grave.